So, David, you've got many, many years of experience in coaching, mentoring and talent development, and you've authored over 60 books now, a wealth of knowledge with regards to particularly programme development, implementation, evaluation. There's been a lot of suggestions that the evidence for mentoring and coaching is largely anecdotal. In your opinion, to what extent would you agree with that view?
I think if we're talking about coaching in particular, then the case for it actually having a financially calculatable outcome is quite small. There have been studies, but methodologically they're not that good, and they do rely a lot on self-reporting. However, when we look at the organisational outcomes of both coaching and mentoring, we can see a lot more usable data. And so, for example, retention of staff increases both in coaching and in mentoring, and particularly in mentoring. We know, for example, that in organisations which have mentoring programs which have been put through the international standards for mentoring programs, there is at least 1/3 higher retention of people who've been on the program versus people who are not. So with control groups. So that's, and in one particular case, there's a massive 1,300% difference. Now that's an outlier, so we don't expect to see that very frequently. But it's clear that from a retention point of view, there is good data, and there is a good store of partly anecdotal, partly narrative data. Which tells us that there is an impact on things like the employee engagement, for example, employee performance. And there have been some old studies now which looked at mentoring and looked at the improvement in people's performance as salespeople. And so one of the studies showed that that salespeople who have a mentor tend to sell more than 20% more than a control group who didn't. Now, it's one study, and we have to be careful that not to put too much reliance on a single study. However, there is enough evidence out there to show us it does have an impact.
So, David, in your opinion, what are the priority areas to evaluating coaching and mentoring programs?
What we've found is it's important to focus on a portfolio, because there are different reasons for wanting to have for measuring. So you might want to measure to see whether the program is working, whether it's delivering what people want, but you might also want to look at the outcomes. And so we would look at a balanced portfolio that would have both relationship outcomes and individual outcomes, or organisational outcomes and individual outcomes, to be more precise. But you would also look at outcomes and enabling factors. So you might want to say, how often do people meet? Because that could be an indicator of the quality and health of the mentoring scheme. How have people moved through the phases of a mentoring relationship? Those would be enabling factors. But outcome factors would be retention, employee commitment, all the other things that we would look at that says the organisation has got some concrete value out of the programme.
David, what tools and methods can organisations use to evaluate coaching and mentoring programmes?
What we found is that people can use a multitude of methods. So some of them can be very informal. Where you've got a steering group, for example, you can ask each member of the steering group to go out and liaise with, say, 6 people and take responsibility for them. Make sure they talk to them, get the themes coming back. So the narrative content, if you like. And that gives you a sense of what's going on. So it's not statistical, but what it does is tell you the undercurrents. And very often we find that reveals all sorts of things that are going on, which are barriers to effectiveness. Either for the mentoring program itself, sometimes for the organisation's people management as well. I know in one particular case, we found that the career structures within an organisation were actually working against it, and they were losing talent of particular kind. They were losing their specialist talent because there wasn't a career route for them to go up. Now the mentoring program and the getting together the data from the mentors actually threw that issue up, and it hadn't been caught before. So there's that informal data. There's also that you can use obviously surveys, but you have to be careful you don't survey people out. And you can survey people at key times in the relationship. And then you just have sessions where you get people together to review the relationship. So what we would find is that in a good, well-managed mentoring program, you bring people back at key points so that you can put them around tables and say, okay, what's happening for you? What do you want more of? What do you want less of in your mentoring relationship? And we do encourage every mentoring relationship to look at what it's doing at several occasions. So we're not just looking at the outcomes, we're looking at relationship management.
What do you think are the pivotal points, the times to evaluate in coaching and mentoring programs?
Well, we find that the key points are firstly before the program starts. What are the expectations of people? What's going on here? Is the climate actually supportive? I mean, we've been into organisations that found that the climate is so negative that you're not going to make the program work unless you take some remedial action. And so that's even before you start, you need to look at the expectations of people and things that might go wrong. Then you'd want to launch the program, and you want to measure whether or not the training was any good, or whether people really feel confident they can use the training they've had. Because what often happens is the mentors in particular it's so new to them that they might take some of it, but a lot of the stuff they say, I'm not really sure I want to go down there. That's something I've not done before. So actually seeing how confident and well-founded do they feel themselves to be in using what they've learned. And then after a couple of meetings, we want them to check whether the mentoring relationship is actually working. Is this the right combination? Are we well matched? So that's an important factor, and of course the relation has to happen in each relationship. But then the mentoring program coordinator needs to check: have people had that conversation? And if it isn't a good match, then you need to look at rematching or helping them in some way. And then you want to measure at key points over the relationship. Is it working? Are they moving through the phases of development of the relationship? Is there additional support that people need? Are they suffering from what we would call relationship droop, where they run out of things to talk about? So all of those things you can measure the temperature of, find out what's going on, and then finally at the end, what's the quality of the mentoring program as it's perceived by the participants and by other stakeholders? What are the outcomes? What's actually changed for the people? And we measure outcomes particularly looking at developmental outcomes, so the learning, the career outcomes, what's actually changed for them career-wise, the enabling ones like having a good personal development plan or better personal development plan, and the emotional ones, what's happened for them emotionally. Do they feel greater self-confidence and a greater sense of self-efficacy? And those would be the core things we would be looking for the individual, but then for the organisation, what was the organisation's purpose for the programme? Has that been fulfilled? Maybe it was to improve diversity at senior levels in an organisation. So you would focus on, has that actually had an impact?
David, as I mentioned, you've got many, many years' experience of coaching and mentoring programmes. So can you share some examples of good practice in evaluation?
I think there are lots of little examples which have impressed me. In one organisation in Asia Pacific, one of the things we did was right at the front, look at what was in the minds of the mentors, the expectations of the mentors and the expectations of the potential mentees, and then we fed it back to them. And they were 180 degrees opposite expectations of what the relationship would be like. And it was a different cultural issue, the expats versus the locals. Now, if we hadn't done that, the program would have probably been launched and would have foundered because people would basically been working at cross purposes. So I think that kind of preliminary measurement, finding out what's going on and the likely barriers, is a really important factor. In other cases, we found that the program managers have gone out and they've just listened to people. They've done focus groups and they've pulled in the data that have really helped them to understand what's going on, not just for the program as a whole, but key people within that program and who's actually not getting the support that they need. And so then they can intervene and actually help the mentor be more effective, or the mentee contribute more to making the relationship work. So I think there's lots of examples that we see, but all of them come down to an attentiveness to understanding what's going on both for the program and for the individuals in it, that parallel measurement.
Thanks so much, David, for participating this evening and sharing your insights with us.
Pleasure.